Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications. The following program is a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and a proud member of the Simply Scary Podcasts Network. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com to learn more about this and our other weekly storytelling programs. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Good evening. I'm storyteller Otis Jiry, and I ain't your grandfather. From where I'm from, we don't do bedtime stories. And if that's what you were expecting, you're in the wrong place. If it's terrifying tales you're after, well then, I've got just the thing. Get comfortable, settle in, turn off the lights, if you dare. Your night is about to get a whole lot darker. Who needs sleep anyway?
Good evening, friends, and welcome to another edition of Scary Stories Told in the Dark. I'm your host, Otis Jiry, and tonight we're heading off the edge of the map into the unknown, the forgotten, and the just plain wrong. You ever pass a building that wasn't there yesterday? A hallway that feels longer than it should? A room on the blueprints that you've never been able to find? Then you already know. Not all territory is meant to be charted. And joining me, as always, is the man who brings a flashlight and a crowbar to every forbidden place, Mr. Malcolm Blackwood.
Glad to be here, Otis. Tonight, we've got 5 tales of unmarked trails, off-limits locations, and places that didn't just go missing, they vanished for a reason. Whether it's a locked room that's not part of any blueprint, a midnight tour that veers off the edge of history, or a bar that wasn't there yesterday. Tonight's tales all have one thing in common. Our protagonists are about to learn that curiosity isn't just dangerous, it's hungry.
So pour a drink, check the locks twice, and whatever you do, don't follow the sound you heard in the walls. Before we venture off the edge of the map, a quick word for our fellow fear seekers. If you love what we do here and want your chills uncut and uninterrupted, consider joining our patrons area.
That's right. Ad-free episodes every week. Full stories, no breaks. And you'll unlock hundreds of hours of horror from the entire Simply Scary Podcast Network.
It's just $7.99 a month, or less if you grab an annual plan. Head over to simplyscarypodcast.com, click on Patrons, and you'll be transported to chillingtalesfordarknights.com, our vault of nightmares.
Support indie horror, feed your fears, and keep the darkness alive.
Now then, let's go somewhere we were never meant to find. Back to the show. Our first tale tonight follows a writer named Neil, who unearths an ancient symbol while helping a dig team in the Pacific Northwest. But the symbol speaks, and once it begins to narrate your life as you live it, there's no turning the page. This is The Whispering Era by Raylan Graye, performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry. Part 1. Dr. Neil Farrow stepped down from the rust-scorched cab of the Helix, his boots sinking slightly into the orange dust as the wind carried dry grains in lazy spirals across the barren flat. The engine idled for a moment longer before the driver cut it and peeled away with a nod, leaving Neil alone at the edge of the dig site. The horizon pulsed faintly in the heat, blurring the division between earth and sky, as if the continent itself resisted definition. He slung his bag over one shoulder and adjusted his hat, eyes narrowing against the harsh glare. Even with polarized lenses, the landscape vibrated with intensity, a heat that was less sensation than pressure. He'd spent time in arid zones before, in North Africa, in southern Utah, but nothing quite compared to this stretch of the Pilbara, where time and terrain had eroded together into a kind of geological hallucination. A cluster of low tents and modular trailers stood farther up the hill, their outlines soft against the shimmering air. The cave system was somewhere beyond that ridge, nested in an ochre-stained cliff that looked like they had bled their color into the ground. By the time Neil reached the main tent, his shirt was soaked beneath the arms and along his back. Flies, undeterred by repellent, clung to his collar and ears. Inside, the air was scarcely cooler, though it was shaded. The field table bore trays of stone fragments, ceramic dust, and 2 laptops, both shut. "Phil!" He turned to see a woman seated behind one of the tables, scribbling into a worn notebook without looking up. Her accent was clipped, but not unfriendly. Australian, vaguely academic. "Dr. Helena Winterfield," she said, rising and offering a hand. "I've read some of your work. Semiotic variants in pre-linguistic societies was required reading in my graduate program." Neil offered a modest smile. "That was years ago. Most of it's been disproven." Helena shrugged. "Well, that's the point of a living discipline, isn't it? Still, we were glad when the university agreed to send you. I'll warn you up front, the locals didn't find this site. A mining company did. It was almost bulldozed before someone noticed the cave mouths. They crossed the camp to the edge of a shallow ravine where a narrow path snaked down into the rock. Neil followed Elena, noting the sloped stone walls narrowing to a jagged fissure barely wide enough for a person. The deeper they went, the cooler it became, and soon the sun was a memory, replaced by dim sodium lanterns mounted at intervals along the cave walls. "This whole system winds back about a kilometer," Helena said, her voice echoing faintly. "Mostly pictographs and ochre layers, some evidence of sediment transport, but we found one chamber that doesn't conform to the rest." She led him through 2 adjoining caverns into a third, where the ceiling narrowed and the floor sloped toward a small hollow in the rear wall. The air inside had a stillness to it, a texture that suggested long abandonment. A single lantern stood at the center, casting light across the uneven stone. Neil approached the wall and crouched. At first, the glyph resembled a coiled shape. It was carved with precision, though the tool marks were worn down. It lacked the familiar stylistic elements common to regional rock art. No surrounding motifs, no anthropomorphic figures, no fauna, no handprints. Just the glyph, embedded alone in the stone. "It's unlike anything I've seen," Neil said. He traced the edge of the symbol with his eyes, noting the curvature and the symmetry. "No companion glyphs?" "None," Elena said. "We triple-checked. It's also unlike any glyph in the surrounding regions. We ran comparisons against the Bradshaw and the Wangina styles, and nothing matches." Neil glanced at her. "May I photograph it?" "Of course, just no rumblings or contact without gloves. The rock is sensitive to oil exposure." He nodded and retrieved his field camera. The flash washed the chamber in harsh white, and for a brief moment, the glyph seemed to recede, as if shy beneath the light. He took several photos from varying angles, adjusted for depth, and then knelt again, jotting in his notebook. "Any theories?" Helena asked. Neil paused, then looked up. It's not a pictograph. There's no representational structure, no syntax or context. If it is language, it's not part of any known family, but it has the feel of recursion or self-reliance. That's unusual. Helena folded her arms. One of the locals, the contractor who flagged it, said it reminded him of something called the Whispering Era. Ever heard of that? Neil frowned. No, that's not part of the Dreamtime corpus. I looked it up. Nothing in the published literature, but a few oral accounts from fringe researchers. Some Aboriginal communities refer to it obliquely, the time outside time. Neil tapped his pen against his notepad. Folklore, then. Probably syncretic. Or possibly misremembered, Helena added. Still, it's the only context we've got. I thought it might interest you. He offered a thin smile. It does. That night, the wind moved in long, slow sighs across the tent fabric, and the insects chirped with mathematical precision beyond the camp's border. Neil sat beneath the glow of a small desk lamp, reviewing the photos on his laptop. The glyph stared back at him from every angle, unchanged, defiant. He played with phonetic arrangements in his notebook, sketching hypothetical articulations. It wasn't uncommon for linguists to attempt pronunciation of non-verbal symbols. Assigning sound was a means of familiarization, a way to tame the unknown. After an hour, he settled on a string of consonant-heavy sounds, balancing what he imagined to be breath control required by its central curves. He leaned forward, closed the laptop, and spoke the sound aloud. It left his mouth with a dry rasp, not unlike the scraping of stone against stone. The sound lingered for a moment in the tent air, but then was gone. He waited. Nothing moved. The world outside the tent continued its low insect rhythm. No tremors, no lights, no voice. He chuckled once under his breath and wrote the phonetics down again, this time noting intonation. A test, he told himself. Satisfied, he closed the notebook and powered down the lamp. As he rolled into his cot, the wind returned, stirring the edge of the tent flap with a soft, scraping flutter. He stared at the canvas ceiling for a long time, his mind already drifting into the contours of the glyph, its movement inward, the spiral that wasn't a spiral, the suggestion of something collapsed or turning in on itself. Then, sleep. Far above the campsite, the red hills sat motionless in the moonlight, their faces blank, the glyph deep in a cave undisturbed. Or so it seemed. Part 2. Neil awoke to the murmured cadence of his own breath, the air in the tent filled with the scent of vinyl, stale sweat, and something he couldn't place, something mineral perhaps, or earthen in a way that suggested recent excavation. The dream, if there had been one, slipped away before he could grasp it. His eyes moved toward the fabric walls where dawn filtered through, casting soft golden shapes against the canvas. He turned over in his cot. A voice whispered, its tone soft and neutral, as though spoken from a respectful distance. Its cadence aligned precisely with the moment he did just that. Neil froze. His first instinct was not fear but confusion, a rational clinical reflex honed over decades in academia. He remained still for several long seconds, waiting to determine whether the sound had been a hypnopompic fragment, some neural misfire in the transition from dream to waking. When nothing else followed, he slowly sat up. The air stirred faintly, but there was no one else in the tent. No movement outside. The sound had not come from a direction, but from within, as if spoken directly behind his eyes. He dressed, made coffee, and took his notebook outside, settling at the camp's edge, beneath a brittle eucalypt whose bark peeled like parchment. The heat was already building. He reviewed his notes from the night before, re-examining the phonetic breakdown of the glyph, checking his logical pathways and adjusting minor symbols. He had not, he reminded himself, expected anything to come from speaking the glyph aloud. It was a thought experiment, nothing more. And if he was now hearing phantom voices, it was likely due to dehydration, stress, or exhaustion. None of those things were new. He lifted his pen, hesitated, and crossed out the vowel cluster. Neil's hand jerked. The pen tip left a crooked scratch across the margin of the page. The voice had returned, identical in tone, as if reading a line of text he had not written. He glanced around, rising from his chair. There were no researchers nearby, no murmured conversation from the other tents, no radios. The voice had not passed through his ears. It had risen instead from somewhere inside the hollow of his skull. He waited again, poised for it to repeat itself or continue, but it did not. The silence that followed was pervasive until at last the buzz of flies reasserted itself, breaking the spell. Back inside the tent, he opened his laptop and reviewed the photos of the glyph, magnifying the central curl until the pixels blurred. He stared into its spiral for what felt like an hour. Over the next 2 days, the voice returned intermittently. It narrated with precision, neither urgent nor emotional. It did not editorialize, it merely observed. He entered the left passage this time, not the right. He drank from the canteen without tasting the water. He considered the glyph again, though it no longer needed his attention. Each time, the phrasing was exact and always aligned with his actions. At first, he chalked it up to the kind of internal monologue common to people who work alone for extended periods. But Neil had studied language long enough to recognize pattern from noise, and what he was hearing was not thought but speech, structured, externalized, and autonomous. The turning point came on the third morning. He had walked out toward the secondary ridge, intending to trace the path to the northern escarpment, which Enola had warned was unstable due to runoff channels. But as he reached the midpoint of the ridge, the voice returned, not as an observation this time, but as something else. He decided not to return to camp yet. The words were subtle, almost courteous, but their implication was immediate. Neil stopped walking. His legs trembled slightly, as though bracing against a wind that wasn't present. The voice had not described something he was doing. It had described something he had not yet decided. And it was correct. He had intended to return, but upon hearing the voice, he paused, suspended in the moment of indecision, and began to reconsider. He waited several beats, then turned back toward the camp. A sharp pressure blossomed behind his right eye, sudden and nauseating, as though something had hooked into the muscle above his cheek and twisted. He doubled over, vision blurring, and let out a low grunt. After 30 seconds, the sensation passed, leaving only a thin trickle of sweat down his spine. He did not attempt to change course again. That evening, he found Helena reviewing core samples outside the geology trailer. The sun had begun its descent, staining the cliffs with blood-colored light, and the air smelled faintly of ozone. "You look like hell," she said, without looking up. "I've been hearing a voice," he replied flatly. Helena's expression shifted. She set the sample tube down and wiped her hands. "Sleep deprivation?" she asked. "I thought so, but it's contextual. It's following me." Helena watched him carefully. "Following you how?" "It narrates what I'm doing. Sometimes just after, sometimes just before, and now it's begun to suggest." Helena crossed her arms. Hallucinations can emerge from extreme isolation, especially in environments like this one. The heat, the light exposure, maybe even something in the water table. You know that. Neil shook his head. "It's not random, it's linguistic. It observes, predicts. I've begun to. He stopped. The voice had spoken again, just behind his eyes, cool and indifferent. He decided not to tell her everything. Helena frowned. You've begun to what? Neil paused, then forced a thin smile. To write it down. Document it, I mean. I'll keep a record. She nodded cautiously. Good. Maybe it'll help to offload it. You just don't keep it to yourself if these things get worse. The next morning, the air was hazy, a low wind moving across the camp from the southeast. Neil stood at the crest of the ridge with his field recorder in one hand and notebook in the other. He had not spoken the glyph aloud again, though he had been tempted more than once. He clicked the recorder on and held it up. I'm documenting a phenomenon, a voice, audible only internally. It began 3 days ago, shortly after phonetic experimentation, with the glyph uncovered in Chamber C. The voice... He began to describe the voice again, knowing it would come for him later, it said. Neil swallowed hard. The voice had arrived on cue, as though sensing the recorder's activation. He continued speaking. The voice narrates my actions. At times, it anticipates them. It never introduces itself. Its tone is neutral, lacking emotional inflection, and yet it seems aware. Not only of what I'm doing, but of what I will do. It is... He wondered whether this would play back. It wouldn't. Neil stopped the recording and hit rewind. He played it back, holding the device close to his ear. White noise hissed through the speaker. No voice, not even his own. He rewound it again. Static. He turned, slowly, and that was when he saw her. Kaylee. She stood at the far side of the ridge, where the rock shelf dropped sharply into a dry basin below. Her figure was small, backlit by the rising sun. She did not move. She simply watched. And just before Neil's eyes met hers, the voice returned. She watched him first. Neil felt something turn in his gut, a slow tightening like thread drawn through cloth. He took a step toward her, but when he blinked, she was no longer there. The voice did not speak again that day. Part 3. The days unraveled. Neil could not remember with certainty when Thursday had ended and Friday had begun, nor how long it had been since the last supply drop arrived by chopper. The sun still rose and fell, but its rhythm no longer aligned with his own. He would sleep after breakfast, then rise at twilight, believing it to be mid-morning. Hours passed too quickly, or not at all. The digital clock in his tent reset it to 0 each night, and his watch hands had grown sluggish, trailing behind real time by margins that widened daily. Even his body betrayed him. He'd glance down to find his boots caked in red dust, though he had not left the tent, at least not recently. The canteen would be half empty when he could not recall opening it. A pen he had used moments before would vanish from the table and reappear later tucked behind his ear. He'd begun labeling items with masking tape and dates, but the handwriting on the labels sometimes shifted. Still his, but looser, almost cursive, as if another hand had borrowed his and returned it changed. The voice did not rest. It spoke when he moved, when he sat, when he blinked. It spoke when he tried to form thoughts. There was no longer a separation between idea and utterance. Every impulse felt observed, verbalized, finalized before he could act. He thought about standing, it would murmur, but remained still, confused as to whether he thought had been his at all. Neil tried to occupy himself with cataloging, sorting artifacts, cross-referencing phonemes, but the moment he began to formulate a plan of action, the voice recited it first, stripping the gesture of intent. He felt like a page already read, the creases of each decision pre-folded, each moment shaped in advance. Then the sun moved backward. It happened late in the afternoon as he stood near the southern bluff recording soil patterns. He'd raised his phone to take a reference shot of the escarpment, and as the shutter clicked, the shadows on the rock face reversed. The amber light climbed upward, then shifted westward in a gentle arc, casting the cliff in rising luminance. It lasted only 5 or 6 seconds, just long enough for Neil to register the impossibility, before the light resumed its downward trajectory, as though reality had stuttered and recovered. No one else reacted. At dinner, Helena and 2 other researchers discussed a regional wildfire. Simon's latest email droned on about funding logistics and an overdue call with the department. The rest of the world, it seemed, continued unaffected. Neil said nothing. That night he opened his notebook and found new markings. They were not recent additions or accidental ink transfers, but deliberate etchings. 3 glyphs, each nested with the inner margin of the page where his linguistic notes ended. One resembled the original spiral he had found in Chamber C, though more elongated, with a small wedge dividing its center. The others were unfamiliar, linear, intersecting forms that suggested something architectural or anatomical. He flipped back through earlier entries. On several pages, faint impressions bled through as if written in invisible ink, made visible only now. Symbols emerged in clusters. A few matched the glyph he had spoken aloud. One bore a resemblance to a proto-cuneiform ideogram denoting breath or word. Neil had no memory of drawing them. He stared at the newest editions for a long time, and for the first time he did not attempt translation. He simply let them exist. They did not need him to understand. Helena confronted him 2 days later. She found him outside the main cave mouth, seated cross-legged on a flat slab of stone, with his notebook open and a recorder propped beside it. He had been speaking to himself, though he could not recall the words. "You've been disappearing," she said, approaching slowly. "We thought you'd gone into the canyon again. You've been skipping meals. You've stopped logging samples. And people are beginning to notice the way you talk." Neil looked up. "What way is that?" "You speak like you're reading, as if the sentences are coming from somewhere else. There's no intonation, no pause." He opened his mouth to reply, but before he could speak, the voice spoke for him. She would say that. She had always doubted his clarity, mistaking comprehension for obsession. Helena flinched. "I didn't say that," she said, frowning, "but I was going to." Neil stood abruptly. "Don't follow me," he snapped. His voice echoed loudly against the rocks. Her face darkened, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then she turned away. Neil remained frozen for several seconds longer, his chest tight as though the words had been spoken through him, not by him. That night the dream came. It began with the sensation of pressure behind his eyes, a rolling static buzz like distant insects humming from inside stone. When the darkness receded, he was standing in a forest that bore no relationship to the landscape outside his tent. The trees were ancient and towering, their coiled roots above ground. Light filtered down in motes the size of ash flakes. The air was cool and wet. Around him, shapes stirred, limbed but indistinct, walking upright but lacking definition. He could not tell how many there were, only that they were older than language and closer than sight. And then the voices came. They did not speak aloud. They intoned within him, resonant and in unison, reverberating in the hollow space of bone and thought. We were before. We are still. We will always be. With each line, Neil felt his skin tighten, as though preparing to shed. The trees around him seemed to bend with intention. From one of the trunks, a glyph emerged, identical to the one from Chamber C, though alive now, pulsing with a biological cadence. The trees whispered again. You gave it voice. Now it remembers. Now it wants. He woke, gasping in the dark. His hands were clenched around the recorder, which he did not remember retrieving. He hit play. Only silence answered. The following evening, Kaylee returned. He saw her just past sunset, standing atop the same bluff where she had first appeared. Her silhouette was perfectly still, framed by the amber sky. Neil approached slowly. She did not move. When he reached the base of the ridge, she raised one hand and pointed, not at him, but beyond, toward a canyon carved deep between the rocks. The wind was rising from it, steady and rhythmic, but it did not howl, it chanted. The sounds were low and layered, comprised of syllables he could not parse, yet each seemed known to him in a way a word once forgotten might return unbidden. With the wind came voices emerging from the canyon. Kaylee said nothing. She only turned and walked away, disappearing into the dusk without looking back. Neil stood there long after the wind had died. Part 4. By the time the voice learned to think ahead of him, Neil had surrendered the idea of ownership over thought. The internal monologue he once trusted, the silent, familiar rhythm of private cognition, was now a palimpsest, overwritten in real time. It was not just that the voice anticipated his decisions, it composed them. Even his resistance had grown performative. When he believed he'd refused an idea, the voice would gently correct him. He thought he had chosen not to enter the cave, it would whisper, but the choice had already been made. And then, unblinking, he would find himself at the cave's entrance, his boots coated in dust he had not consciously walked through. The lantern already lit in his left hand, his right adjusting the strap of a bag he did not recall packing. The dissonance between intention and action widened daily. His limbs moved with practiced certainty, but his awareness always arrived a beat too late, lagging behind motor function. Sometimes he would speak and hear the words as if read aloud by a stranger. The cadence was stilted, the emphasis wrong, and his voice, still recognizably his, carried the flat effect of rote recitation. Others noticed. 2 field assistants had stopped addressing him altogether, passing notes instead of questions, choosing Elena when possible. She, too, had begun watching him with narrowed eyes, her posture guarded. There was no longer confrontation in her voice, only caution, as if she suspected contagion and did not wish to speak it aloud for fear of making it true. He tried to write it down, hoping perhaps to map the progression, if not as science, then as confession. He sat at the folding table outside his tent, twilight settling over the ridge, the crickets already beginning their low chorus. He opened the notebook to a blank page. His hand trembled as he brought the pen down. Before he could begin, the ink scrawled across the page in a smooth, fluid motion. The words formed perfectly, each one centered in neat lines. He watched as his own hand rendered phrases he had not yet considered, the voice rising in perfect tandem with the pen. He sat to write what he had already been written. There would be no first draft, no hesitation. He was not the author. Neil dropped the pen. It rolled across the table and fell into the dirt. His hand still twitched, the tenons straining slightly against invisible tethers. When he opened the notebook again later, he found 3 more pages filled, each line signed only with a symbol, an unfamiliar variation of the original glyph, now elongated, segmented, almost vertebral in appearance. He tried to leave. He chose the western trail at dawn, following a dry riverbed that curved around the basin and led through a narrow pass beyond the canyon's mouth. He brought only essentials: water, a flare, a small radio, and avoided looking at the ridge where Kaylee often appeared. The sun climbed higher, the path widened. He walked for what felt like several hours. The trail should have led to a service road. It had yesterday and the day before. But when he crested the final rise, the camp lay below, unchanged. The same tents, the same dust, the same flags fluttering from the generator. He turned around, paced backward, and retraced his road, testing each turn and marker. He walked slower this time, tried cutting diagonally across a stretch of scrub to forge an alternate road. When he climbed the next hill, the camp was there again. The voice did not mock him, it did not explain, it simply observed. He understood now. There was no outside. The threshold had shifted. That night he began to carve. He started with his notebook margins, but soon his hands found other surfaces. Rocks, tent poles, the aluminum skin of the supply crate. At some point he discovered a small chisel in one of the storage bins. He didn't remember retrieving it nor selecting the stone slates stacked near the cave mouth, but each night new symbols appeared. He would wait to find the grooves already shaped, the tools beside his cot dusted with stone shavings. Some glyphs mirrored those found on the walls of Chamber C. Others were newer, more intricate. Their lines curled inward in layers, as if folding time into form. He stopped questioning the origin of the carvings. Their knowledge of their creation arrived only after the fact, understood like instinct, like muscle memory. Each symbol shimmered faintly in his peripheral vision, their lines bending slightly when he tried to look away. Helena was gone. No one saw her leave, though someone claimed they heard her voice calling near the gorge. Her tent was undisturbed, her gear untouched. The radio still buzzed faintly with static, but she did not return the next morning, or the one after. The team filed a formal report. A helicopter swept the surrounding regions. A few of the others began packing. No one asked Neil what he thought had happened. No one came near him. Kaylee, however, remained. She stood at the entrance of Chamber C at dusk, her frame outlined by the torchlight within. She did not enter or speak. Each time Neil passed by the chamber, she was there, calm and silent, her eyes following him. Neil no longer dreamed. His sleep had become episodic and fractal, filled with fragments of half-formed memory and interrupted by moments of consciousness that did not belong to him. He'd close his eyes and open them in new places, his hands already moving. The voice had stopped speaking aloud. It no longer needed to. There were now two streams of thought in his head, one silent and ancient, the other still clinging to the shape of his old self, and he could feel them converging. One afternoon he stood inside the chamber and placed his palm against the original glyph. His fingers trembled, but his hand did not withdraw. He understood now. He was no longer alone inside himself. He was being overridden. Part 5. He moved with practiced rhythm, the motions of the body governed now by a script that no longer required rehearsal. Each step traced the outline of a path long since memorized, though not by the man himself. He no longer thought in terms of desire nor of doubt. What once had been Neil Farrell, scholar, skeptic, man of language, was now a vessel shaped by utterance, carried forward by the momentum of a voice that required no breath. He rose at dawn and moved from tent to tent, ensuring each sample was sorted, each note indexed. He returned to Chamber C before the others woke. There he carved, always the same symbols, always the same spiral at the center. The others had come 2 days prior, a fresh crew, dispatched by the university to replace those unsettled by the disappearance of Helena Winterfield and the silence that followed. They arrived in convoy, their laughter strange and sharp against the muted backdrop of stone. They found Neil seated beside the fire pit, smiling faintly, his hands folded in his lap. His eyes were calm, clear and distant, like someone mid-recital. When they spoke to him, he responded politely. He welcomed them to the site. He offered his assistance. At first, they didn't notice the odd cadence of his speech. He handed them his notebook, worn and dust-filmed, the covers stained with ochre dust and sweat. Inside were pages of glyphs, carefully drawn and annotated. At the center of each page was a spiral, its shape identical across entries. Beneath it, a phrase, "This is the first breath." Some of them studied the symbols, intrigued. A few dismissed them as pre-contact derivations outside the regional style. One young researcher, fresh from graduate work in Darwin, suggested they represented a mnemonic encoding system, an ancient attempt to store sound. That night he dreamed of a voice. On the fourth evening, another followed. She was older, experienced, respected in the field. She had scoffed when Neil first spoke of the glyph's phonetic architecture, calling it speculative indulgence. But she had taken the notebook to her tent, and under lantern light she had traced the spiral with her fingertip. She had sounded it out quietly, a whisper barely audible above the breeze. The moment passed. She felt a brief nausea, and then nothing. She closed the notebook, muttered something about superstition, and went to sleep. At 3:17 a.m., she sat bolt upright. Her tent was silent. The voice had just described her waking. The next morning, she spoke little. Her eyes followed Neil's as they crossed paths. She did not smile. By the afternoon, she had begun taking notes in the margin of his notebook. Neil said nothing. The others noticed subtle shifts. Tools were misplaced, their labels rewritten in different handwriting. Symbols appeared overnight along the cave's walls, clean, precise, and unweathered, as though newly etched by someone with unshaking hands. A linguistics intern was found muttering to herself in the storage tent, eyes closed, the same phrase repeated with each breath. "We are before, we are still, we will always be." When asked about it later, she remembered nothing. Neil observed without interference. His presence became an anchor. The others felt safer near him, even when they could not explain why. He remained helpful, quiet, and attentive. Only one of them expressed concern. A technician named Griggs, who had arrived late due to illness, began to ask questions. He confronted Neil one evening beside the canyon. "You haven't said a thing about Helena," he said. "Or the others who left. That doesn't bother you?" Neil turned to face him. "She has spoken," he said. "She remains." Griggs stared, unsure if he had heard correctly. He started to reply, but paused. Somewhere nearby, the winds shifted. A low murmuring filled the air, a layering of syllables too faint to be words. Griggs looked up. "Do you hear that?" But Neil was already walking away. That night, the stars faded too early. The moon rose and trembled in the sky like a dropped coin. Several on the team remarked on the shift in air pressure, the sudden stillness that seemed to settle just before dawn. The wind came again at sunrise, steady, rhythmic, and full of whispering, and the spiral began to reappear. One morning, carved into a radio casing, another edged into the dust on the windshield. Once found beneath the lid of a lunch container, drawn in oil from a worker's fingers. None of them claimed responsibility. No one could remember seeing it done. From the ridge above the camp, Kaylee watched in silence. Her silhouette framed the dawn light unmoving. She stood where she always had, at the edge of things, at the boundary between what had been and what would be. From the canyon mouth, the chanting wind rose again, threading between stone and memory. Below, someone spoke the glyph aloud. The word moved, and the myth spread. And that was The Whispering Era by Raylan Graye, performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry.
Now, I've heard of stories being immersive, but that one really took it literally.
Hard to enjoy writing when the story's already finished, and the narrator knows what you'll do before you do.
Up next, we bring you a different kind of haunting. One hidden inside a home, and a warning written by a man who knew too much, far too late. In our second tale tonight, we'll meet Kevin, who never wanted to return to his childhood home. But after his father's death, inheritance brings him back, along with a handwritten note containing just one line, warning him about one particular door. Don't open it. This is My Father Kept a Dead Room by Sebastian Ormond, performed by yours truly, Malcolm Blackwood. Part 1. The road narrowed as Kevin drove north, the trees arching overhead like clasped fingers, thick enough in places to blot out the afternoon light. With each mile, the canopy grew denser, the asphalt rougher, the shoulders swallowed by the unchecked growth of grass and brush. He hadn't been out this way in years, not since he was 19 and angry, too stubborn to come back even when the silence between him and his father stretched on long enough to take root. He found the farmhouse exactly where memory had left it, crouched low at the end of a gravel drive, its white siding now more gray than anything else. The porch sagged at the center. One of the upstairs windows was boarded over. The chimney was cracked along one side, and the wind teased a loose shingle that clacked faintly as he stepped out of the car. The lawyer met him there, a man too tan and well-pressed to feel native to the land, holding a thick envelope and a set of tarnished brass keys. The exchange was brief, perfunctory. The will had been straightforward, everything to Kevin. No debts, no remaining family to contest, just one handwritten addendum in his father's crooked script, barely legible through the erratic slant and pressure of the pen. Don't open the dead room. The lawyer offered no comment on the note, only asked for a signature and handed him the keys. Kevin watched the man's SUV disappear in the cloud of dust it kicked up behind him, then turned to face the house. Even before he stepped inside, the air around it felt heavier. Not in any literal sense, no humidity, no looming storm, but with a stillness that didn't belong in the open country. The woods behind the house stood motionless, branches unmoved despite the breeze that tousled his hair. Somewhere to the left, a crow cried once and then fell silent, as if embarrassed by its own voice. The screen door groaned under his hand. The main door stuck just slightly before opening inward with the quiet protest of long unstirred hinges. The smell that greeted him was neither wholly unfamiliar nor remotely welcome. An old blend of dust, aged wood, mildew, and something faintly sour. Not rot exactly, but a scent that carried history. Something that had steeped itself into the bones of the structure, long past the point of washing out. He stepped into the front room, the familiar creak beneath his feet giving way in places to an unexpected softness in the wood. Furniture stood where it had decades before, preserved like a museum of some lesser-known grief. The couch, its floral pattern faded and threadbare, still bore the indents from the bodies of the people who had once made this place a home. The fireplace was blackened from years of use, the iron tools beside it arranged precisely as his father had always insisted. A portrait of his mother hung above the mantel, her smile slightly crooked, as if caught in a moment of uncertainty. He lingered there, watching her, trying to remember the sound of her laugh, the way she used to press her palm against his forehead when he had nightmares. She had died when he was 12. They told him she'd fallen down the stairs. He remembered blood in the way his father didn't speak for 3 days afterward. Peter Cranston had been a hard man to live with after that. He had never been cruel exactly, but cold in a way that made cruelty feel like a more honest option. He worked with his hands and spoke little, and when he did speak, it was with a precision that left no room for argument or intimacy. Kevin had learned to avoid questions. He had learned not to ask about the closed doors, the locked shed, or the nights when his father would wake from sleep and stand in the hallway, whispering things too soft to hear. He didn't know why he'd accepted the inheritance. Maybe curiosity had bloomed where resentment had begun to wither. Maybe it was guilt. Or maybe, in a life now marked by divorce and debt, and the slow sinking feeling that he'd become a hollow echo of the man he'd once feared becoming, he simply had nowhere else to go. The hallway to the left of the front room looked just as it had all those years ago, narrow, shadowed, and flanked by closed doors. One bedroom, a bathroom, a linen closet. And at the very end, tucked into an alcove that didn't quite match the layout of the house, was the door his father had called the dead room. Even as a child, Kevin had known something was wrong with it. The door had always been locked, not just latched, but reinforced. It had changed over the years, first a padlock, then a latch bar, and finally, in his later visits before the estrangement, boards nailed directly across the frame. Now it stood as he remembered it last, 8 warped planks running across the surface, each secured with a line of heavy iron nails, their heads dulled and rusted. The wood around the door was warped, not by water damage or age, but as if pushed outward from within, like the pressure of something massive and unseen had strained against the house's structure for years and left behind the architectural equivalent of a bruise. He reached out and touched one of the boards. It was cold, much colder than the surrounding wall. A breath of air escaped beneath the frame, not enough to feel, but enough to carry with it a scent that didn't belong anywhere inside a house. Damp earth, rust, a hint of something sweeter underneath, like the way lilies smelled when left too long in a vase. Kevin stepped back. The house had gone quiet again. He returned to the front room, took a seat on the edge of the old couch, and stared at nothing in particular. The envelope containing the will lay on the table beside him, open to the page with his father's final instruction. "Don't open the dead room." The words looked like they had been written with a shaking hand. Maybe they had. Or maybe the shaking had come not from age or illness, but from fear. He stared down the hall until dusk pressed against the windows, and even then, he didn't turn on a single light. Part 2. The morning came slowly, through gauzy curtains the color of stale parchment. Kevin had slept on the couch, though slept was a generous word for the shallow, uneasy doze that had passed for rest. He woke with the sensation of something having watched him through the night, though there were no open doors, no obvious disturbances, and the house stood in the same perfect, uncanny stillness it had when he'd arrived. He moved from room to room, opening doors and drawers, pulling back dusty sheets and peering through warped window panes. Everything remained where it had been decades ago, each item preserved as though curated by someone trying to simulate the comfort of familiarity without understanding what actually made a place feel like home. The furniture bore the same stains, the same faint scratches, a scar along the surface of the coffee table where he had once dragged a toy car in a moment of disobedience. The couch cushions still dipped toward the center. The bookshelf, still crammed with faded paperbacks and the odd tin of long-expired tobacco, leaned the way it always had, as though refusing correction out of stubbornness rather than neglect. In the kitchen, he found his mother's floral dishware stacked neatly beside the sink, a fine crust of dust blunting the once bright patterns. The refrigerator stood unplugged, the door ajar and empty, except for the yellowed husk of a magnet clinging to the inside of the frame. Its once cheerful message, "Don't forget to smile," had faded, into a ghost of itself. Returning to the hallway, he paused at the sight of the dead room door, which in daylight looked no less menacing than it had the night before. It sat slightly off-center within the alcove, not just crooked, but improperly aligned with the rest of the hallway. The seams of the adjacent walls didn't match. The baseboards curved in toward it ever so slightly, and the overhead trim dipped where it met the frame, as if the house had warped itself over the years in quiet protest of the room's presence. Kevin crouched and ran his hand along the floorboards. The wood shifted subtly beneath his touch, giving the impression that the hallway had once been forced to accommodate the room, like a tree grown around a foreign object, swallowing it slowly, but never quite erasing the evidence of intrusion. He searched the drawers of his father's old desk, pulling aside rusted pens and unopened mail. In one compartment, hidden beneath a stained manila folder marked with half-legible utility bills, he found a laminated sheet that looked like part of an appraisal report. Floor plans drawn in faded blue ink. The living room, kitchen, 2 bedrooms, and a bathroom were all clearly marked. There was even an outline for the detached tool shed out back. But the dead room wasn't included. The hallway was rendered as a straight line, unbroken, terminating in what should have been blank wall. No alcove, no door. Kevin folded the sheet and returned it to the drawer, unease blooming low in his chest. If the room wasn't part of the original floor plan, then it had been added later. But when? And why would Peter have gone to such lengths to obscure it? Upstairs, the carpeted landing creaked beneath his steps. Most of the doors were shut, but one stood slightly ajar. He pushed it open and stepped into what had once been his bedroom. The air smelled faintly of dust and old fabric. Light filtered through sheer curtains onto wallpaper he hadn't seen since childhood. Sky blue, dotted with cartoon clouds and birds in flight. His bed still stood in the corner, smaller than he remembered. A toy rocking horse waited in the opposite corner, its red paint chipped at the muzzle, one of the handles broken. He crossed the room and found a cassette player on the shelf, covered in a veil of gray. He blew across its surface, stirring motes into the air, and pressed the power button. Nothing happened. The batteries were long dead. The shelves were lined with forgotten relics of his youth, paperback mysteries, action figures missing limbs, crayon drawings faded with time. He found one of himself and his mother, stick figures holding hands beneath a bright yellow sun. In the corner, he had written, "Me plus Mom plus home," in clumsy, oversized letters. His father was conspicuously absent from the image. By the time the sun dipped below the treetops, Kevin had explored nearly every inch of the house except for the dead room. He made a small dinner out of the canned goods in the pantry and ate in silence at the kitchen table, listening to the way the wind slipped through the cracked seals of the old windows. As dusk deepened, the shadows stretched longer down the hallway, pooling near the dead room's base like ink spilled from a shattered bottle. That night, as he lay on the couch once more, he heard it for the first time. Tap, tap, pause, tap, tap, tap. It came from the hallway, and more specifically, from behind the sealed door. The rhythm was deliberate, too structured to be the casual shifting of the house as it cooled for the night. It continued for nearly 2 minutes, unbroken, before falling silent again. Kevin held his breath and listened for the creak of floorboards, the rush of movement down the hallway. Anything that might suggest the sound had been made by something he could identify and explain. But there was only stillness. Not even the wind stirred the leaves outside. Sleep came slowly, and when it finally did, it brought with it the shape of his father, seated in the old chair by the hearth. Peter's face was drawn and colorless in the dream, his mouth slack as if mid-sentence. though Kevin heard nothing at first, only the crackle of fire that gave off no warmth and the distant, hollow sound of dripping water echoing through what seemed to be the space beneath the floor. Then, in a voice dry as leaves ground underfoot, Peter leaned forward and whispered, "It listens. Always has." Kevin woke just before dawn, his breath shallow, the house silent again, save for the wind pushing gently against the siding. The dead room waited in the dark behind him, patient and still. Part 3. The next morning brought a rare warmth that filtered through the thinning trees and cast a hazy gold across the yard. Kevin stepped off the porch and began pacing the perimeter of the property, tracing the uneven fence line that had once seemed vast to him in his youth. The tall grasses tugged at his jeans, brushing against his shins like 100 searching fingers. The sky above was clear, but the stillness that clung to the farmhouse had not lifted. It followed him in subtle ways, the quiet that dulled the sound of distant birds, the way the shadows beneath the eaves held fast despite the rising sun. As he passed the edge of the field where the ground dipped toward the old stone well, he saw someone standing near the tree line. At first, he assumed it was another neighbor, someone curious about the property, or there to pass along condolences. But as she approached, he recognized her gait, that cautious way of walking over unfamiliar ground, even when she'd known it all her life. "Kevin?" she asked, her voice as brittle as the leaves beneath her shoes. He stopped walking and turned to face her fully. Her hair was thin and white, her skin pale and splotched with sun damage, and she wore a denim jacket too large for her frame. Though he couldn't remember the last time he had seen her, something in her expression stirred a memory of lemonade in a cloudy glass, of a dog barking from a porch across the field, of a voice calling him in for dinner. "Mrs. Thorne," he said with a nod. "It's been a long time." "Too long," she replied, folding her arms across her chest. "You look like your mother. Around the eyes, I mean." Kevin offered a tired smile. "That's what they used to tell me." She looked past him toward the house, her gaze lingering on the upstairs windows, then drifting slowly down toward the roofline, where the shingles had begun to curl like old bark. "I heard about Peter," she said. "I suppose you've come to sort things out." He hesitated for a moment, unsure of how much he wanted to explain, but nodded anyway. "He left the house to me. Everything, actually." Something in her eyes shifted then. Not surprise exactly, but confirmation of something she had already suspected. "He left you all of it," she repeated, then added more softly, "Of course he did." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the wind move through the high grass. Edna took a few steps closer, her boots crunching against the gravel near the edge of the path. "I remember your mother," she said. "She was good to me, always made too much food and sent you over with Tupperware full of it. She used to hum while she hung laundry out back. Some old tune, something soft and low like it was meant only for her. You'd run through the sheets laughing." Kevin's throat tightened unexpectedly. He remembered that too, the way the white linens would balloon in the wind, the smell of detergent warmed by the sun, the sound of his mother's voice just barely audible through the fabric. "She was kind," he said, patient. "She was more than that," Edna said, her voice taking on a firmer edge. "She was alive. That house, it changed after she passed." Her eyes returned to the house, and this time she squinted slightly, as if trying to see through the walls themselves. "He left you the house," she said again, this time more as a statement than a question. "Tell me something. Did he say anything about the room?" Kevin stiffened slightly, unsure of how to respond. He didn't need to ask which room she meant. "He left a note," he admitted. "Just a few words. He said not to open it." Edna made a sound deep in her throat, something between a sigh and a grunt of disapproval. "I figured as much," she muttered. He was always too proud to admit when something was bigger than him. But he knew. In the end, I think he knew he couldn't keep it out forever. "What is it?" Kevin asked, his voice lower now, more cautious. "That room, it's not on the floor plan, and I don't even think it's supposed to be part of the house." She turned and looked at him, then, eyes clear and unflinching. "It's never been part of the house," she said. "Not really. It was always there, even before your father bought the place. I remember it from when I was a girl, back when the old Crawfords lived there. Before them, it belonged to a man named Eli Garner. Folks said he dug the well too deep and let something in. That was the kind of story people told to scare kids. But that room," she shook her head, "that room was already there. Nobody built it. It just was." Kevin tried to reconcile that with the warped hallway, the misaligned woodwork, the absent blueprints. He wanted to argue, to push back against what she was saying, but he couldn't find a foundation strong enough to stand on. "Did you ever go inside?" he asked. Edna hesitated. Then, with visible discomfort, she shook her head. "No," she said, "not once. But your father did." "When?" "After your mother died. He locked himself in there one night. I remember because the power went out all across the ridge, and I saw his lantern flickering through the side window until almost morning. When he came out, he didn't speak to anyone for weeks." She drew her jacket tighter around herself and took a step back toward the woods. "He was different after that. Not just quiet. Off. Something behind the eyes, like he was carrying more than just grief. The animals started dying soon after. Strays at first, then our barn cat went missing. Then a goat. No signs of struggle, no blood. Just gone." She paused. "I used to think he was just grieving. But now," she looked back toward the house, "now I think he let it out. Or maybe just let it see him." Kevin's skin prickled in the morning light. The house behind him loomed with the same subtle pressure it always had, its presence undeniable, though nothing visible had changed. Edna gave him a final glance and said, "If you're smart, you'll pack up what matters and leave the rest behind. That house isn't yours. Not really. It's just waiting for the next name to carve into its bones." Then she turned and walked away, her figure swallowed by the tall grass and the tree line beyond. Kevin stood alone again, the sun now climbing higher, though the warmth had faded from the air. Part 4. It began with the moths. Kevin noticed them late in the afternoon as he passed through the hallway, a mug of lukewarm instant coffee in one hand, his other trailing lightly along the discolored wallpaper. The house had been quiet most of the day, save for the groan of its bones settling in the changing temperature. He had taken to talking aloud just to hear a voice fill the space, even if it was only his own. That afternoon, however, the stillness had seemed different, expectant. He paused in front of the dead room door. The smell that issued from beneath the threshold had grown stronger, a mix of mineral dampness and something faintly organic, like the wet insides of a log rotting from the center out. He crouched to inspect it, unsure what had drawn his attention until he saw the thin, wavering line that framed the bottom of the door. Moths. They lay in a perfect row, their wings curled and powdered, their legs folded delicately beneath them. Perhaps 24 in all. None moved. None bore signs of injury. Kevin counted them twice before standing and backing away. A quick survey of the hallway's baseboards revealed no others, only those placed with uncanny precision as if arranged by hand. He said nothing that night. He didn't mention them aloud, not even to himself. When he passed the hallway again after dinner, he averted his gaze entirely. By morning, they were gone. Not merely disturbed or scattered, but gone. No husks, no wings, no powder smudges, not even a trace of their fragile corpses clinging to the edge of the threshold. The air around the door, however, had grown colder. When he pressed his hand to the wall beside it, the chill sank into his knuckles like the touch of ice water. Something shifted in Kevin after that. He told himself it was irrational, just the product of stress, of being alone in a place burdened with too much memory and too little clarity. But the sensation of being watched began to take on a texture. It was no longer ambient. It had direction. It had focus. He resolved to remove the boards. There was no grand moment of defiance or epiphany, no dramatic swell of resolve, only a quiet morning, the distant call of a hawk overhead, and the feeling that waiting any longer would serve no purpose but to invite more silence into a place already overrun with it. He retrieved the toolbox from the shed behind the house, brushing off cobwebs and mildew to uncover a pry bar and claw hammer, both rusted but serviceable. With the tools in hand, he returned to the hallway and stood before the door for nearly 5 full minutes, listening. The house gave no protest. The first nail came free with effort, shrieking slightly as the rusted head gave way beneath the hammer's bite. Kevin worked it free, felt the resistance in the wood, and leaned into it with a pressure born not of confidence, but of exhaustion. He had removed 2 more when the light overhead flickered, not once, but 3 times in rapid succession, and then stabilized. That was enough, for now. He stowed the tools in the front closet and told himself he would resume the task later. A few hours of distance might lend him the perspective to proceed with a clearer head. But when he returned the following morning, the tools were gone. He searched the closet twice, then the kitchen, then the back porch, the shed, the crawl space beneath the stairs, every place he could imagine having left them. They had vanished as completely as the moths. The house began to shift after that, in subtle ways that eluded clear articulation. At first, it was the arrangement of objects. A chair he didn't remember moving turned slightly toward the window. A tea towel that had been folded across the oven handle now left crumpled in the sink. A spoon resting on the counter where he was certain he hadn't used one. Then came the photographs. Kevin woke one morning to find that every framed picture in the house, every childhood snapshot, every wedding photo, every fading print of him and his mother smiling in the sun had been turned backward. Each frame still rested exactly where it had been, but their backs now faced the room, as though the images inside had decided, of their own accord, that they no longer wished to be seen. He returned them to their proper orientation, but the message had settled somewhere deep in his ribs, heavy and unwelcome. The next incident involved the tapes. There were dozens of them in his old bedroom, cassettes from childhood, most unlabeled or scrawled with vague identifiers like Road Trip or Xmas '89. Out of habit more than intent, Kevin popped one into the player and sat cross-legged on the carpet, expecting to hear old songs or the echo of his parents' voices narrating some long-ago moment. What he heard instead was a conversation. It wasn't familiar, it wasn't even clear. A man and a woman, voices muffled and strained through a thin veil of static, arguing in a language he couldn't identify. It wasn't foreign in the usual sense. It had the cadence of something half-remembered, the tonal pull of a lullaby spoken through clenched teeth. The tape ended abruptly with a high-pitched whine. When he rewound it and pressed play again, there was only silence. That night, Kevin descended into the basement. The stairs groaned with each step, and the bare bulb at the base of the stairs swayed slightly in the draft that moved along the concrete floor. The space beneath the house had always unnerved him as a child, though he had rarely been allowed down there. Peter had kept it locked, or claimed the floor was unsafe. But now the padlock was broken, and the basement stood open. He explored slowly, stepping over the discarded paint cans and broken shelves. In the far corner, he found a wooden crate beneath a tarp. Inside, amid rotting books and corroded tools, he found a single sheet of paper torn from a spiral notebook. The handwriting was not Peter's. It read, "The dead aren't quiet. They only wait." He pocketed the page and climbed the stairs. That night's dream was different. His mother sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded before her, a faint smile on her lips. The room was painted in deep sepia tones as though filtered through memory, and the air around her shimmered faintly like heat rising from asphalt. "You were supposed to be mine," she said. Her voice was calm, but it echoed unnaturally, rebounding off the walls with a distortion that made it seem as though others were speaking the words in perfect unison. "You were supposed to be mine," she repeated. "Not his, not theirs." Kevin tried to move, but his limbs felt submerged in syrup, slow and unresponsive. "You can still be," she said. Then he woke, gasping, and sat upright on the couch. His hands were dirty. Soil clung to his fingernails, and the scent of loam rose from his skin as he looked down at his palms. Something sharp pricked the ball of his left hand. He turned it over and saw a splinter lodged deep beneath the skin. Old wood, dark, and slick with something he didn't recognize. The hallway behind him yawned in silence, the door to the dead room still sealed. But the house felt closer now. Part 5. The walls were soft to the touch, not the kind of softness that came from age or disrepair, but a pliable give beneath the plaster, as if something inside had swollen outward and was pushing gently against the surface, testing for weakness. Kevin stood in the second-floor hallway, fingers hovering just above a water-stained seam where the wallpaper had begun to peel. The edges curled like dead leaves, revealing the flaking yellow glue underneath. He ran his thumb along the torn flap and pulled slowly, peeling it downward in a long, ragged strip that exposed the wall underneath. What he found there stopped him cold. Drawn in what appeared to be charcoal or scorched wood were dozens of rough symbols. Some looked like eyes, others like pits. Concentric circles spiraled outward from jagged centers, each ring irregular, as if the hand that drew them had trembled with more than mere age. Stick figures dotted the spaces in between, some with arms upraised in supplication, others bent backwards, limbs contorted unnaturally. None had heads. Where the heads should have been, there were only black smudges or dark, vertical slashes. He tore more paper away and uncovered a figure larger than the rest, a crude silhouette composed entirely of interlocked rings. It seemed to stretch and shift as he stared at it, the lines subtly overlapping in ways that defied sense. In its chest, a gaping circle had been etched deeper than the rest, cutting into the plaster itself. Kevin stepped back. For a moment, the hallway seemed narrower, as if the walls had inched inward while he wasn't looking. In the study downstairs, he searched for context, anything that might explain what he'd found. Peter had never been one to keep journals or personal correspondence, at least not that Kevin had ever seen. But behind a row of tax records and expired insurance forms, tucked beneath a stack of National Geographics from the early 70s, he found a small black book with a cracked leather spine. No title, no author, just dust and the unmistakable stink of mildew. The first dozen pages were empty, but then the handwriting began, tight, angular script. Peter's. It breathes when I'm near it. I don't sleep in the west bedroom anymore. I hear the pulse too clearly there. The mouths aren't real, but they move. I've seen them move. Some entries read like confessions, others more like incantations. Kevin flipped through dozens of pages, most rambling and incoherent, full of crossed-out lines and scrawled margins, but a few stood out with jarring clarity. It wasn't the fall that took her, it was the house. And another. The thing in the room wasn't always in the room. It was beneath it first. The wood just learned how to hold it. Kevin closed the book slowly, feeling the brittle pages shift beneath his fingers. He sat for a long time after that, staring out the living room window as the light drained from the sky. The memory came unbidden. His mother's scream, a single sharp note that had sliced through the house like a needle, followed by silence. He remembered rushing to the stairs and seeing his father kneeling beside her crumpled body. There had been no visible wound, no blood that he could see, but something in the way Peter had looked up at him, hollow-eyed and wild, had etched itself permanently into his mind. They had told him she slipped, that it had been sudden, tragic, an accident. But that memory, now paired with Peter's journal and the strange symbols hidden behind the wallpaper, unraveled in his mind. Later, in the crawl space behind the kitchen, Kevin knelt with a flashlight in hand. The air was thick with dust and insulation fibers, and the beam of the light cut through it in slow, meandering swirls. He moved aside an old storage crate, then a rolled-up carpet, revealing a shallow depression in the packed earth. Something pale protruded from the dirt. He brushed it clean with his hand and uncovered a rib cage, small and narrow, too slender for a dog, too long for a cat. The skeleton was intact, but bent at an impossible angle as though crushed from the inside. The bones gleamed faintly, not with the dry chalkiness of something long dead, but with a slick sheen that spoke of wetness, of recentness. He scrambled out of the crawl space and shut the panel behind him, but the cold that had risen in his spine did not fade. That night, just after sunset, a knock came at the door. He opened it to find Edna standing on the porch, her expression drawn and her lips pressed into a thin, pale line. "I saw your light was on," she said. "I need to talk to you." Kevin stepped aside and let her in. She didn't remove her coat. She didn't sit. She remained standing just inside the doorway, eyes flicking over the room as though searching for something invisible but close. "You've been poking around, haven't you?" she said. "I told you not to." "I haven't opened it," Kevin replied. "The door's still sealed." "That doesn't mean it hasn't noticed," Edna said. "It always notices." He tried to keep his voice even. "What is it?" She shook her head, her gaze growing distant. It's not something you can name. Not properly. It's not a ghost. It's not a demon. It's more like... She struggled for a word, then settled on a memory with too much weight behind it. A thought that learned how to grow teeth. She moved closer, lowering her voice. If you break the seal, it won't be you who pays. That's how it works. It doesn't take the one who opens the door. It takes what matters to them. It's worse that way. It knows. Kevin's mouth felt dry. Why tell me this now? Because I think it's already loose enough to look, she said, and I think it remembers you. She turned without another word and walked back into the darkness, her form vanishing at the edge of the porch light. That night, Kevin stood in the hallway long past midnight. The boards over the dead room were still in place, though he had begun to notice hairline gaps between them and where the wood bowed outward slightly, straining at the nails. When he returned to head back to the living room, he saw a figure at the far end of the hallway. Peter stood there, or something that wore his shape. He was clothed the way Kevin remembered from his childhood. Denim shirt, canvas work pants, boots dulled with age. But the posture was wrong. Too stiff, too straight. The shoulders pulled back as if mounted on strings. And the face. God, the face. The eyes were too wide, the smile too broad. A fixed expression that never shifted, not even as Kevin stepped backward in shock. The figure did not speak. It did not blink. When Kevin dared to look again, it was gone. By morning, the dread had calcified in his chest. He walked the property to clear his head and found a neighbor's dog lying near the fence line. The body was intact except for the abdomen, which had been split open with surgical precision. The interior was hollow. The house watched him from the hilltop, its windows blank and sightless. And behind its walls, something waited. Part 6. Kevin waited until nightfall, not out of a strategy or ritual, but because the decision, once made, brought with it a heaviness that delayed motion. He spent the final daylight hours pacing the house, lingering by windows, occasionally touching the doorframe of the dead room with the edge of his fingers. When the sun finally disappeared beyond the tree line and the shadows deepened into full, unbroken dark, he retrieved the hammer from beneath the sink, one he'd found tucked behind a leaky pipe, hidden perhaps by Peter or the house itself, and returned to the hallway. The boards over the door remained in place, though more of them had begun to bow outward, nails protesting quietly in their sockets. Kevin positioned himself in front of the door and, with careful pressure, drove the claw of the hammer beneath the first rusted head. It resisted. Then, with a shriek, it gave way. The sound echoed down the hallway, sharp and metallic, unnatural in the silence. He removed the first board and dropped it to the floor, then the second, and the third. Each one seemed more reluctant than the last, as if torn from flesh rather than wood. When the final plank clattered against the floorboards, Kevin stepped back and studied the bare door underneath. It was older than he remembered, older than the rest of the house even. The grain was blackened in places, not with rot or age, but as if scorched from the inside out. He gripped the knob and turned. The door swung inward with a reluctant groan, revealing nothing beyond. It was a void that swallowed the hallway's meager light, a pitch so complete that the frame might have opened onto another dimension altogether. Kevin raised his flashlight, a broad-beamed LED, and swept it across the threshold. The beam disappeared less than 2 feet in, devoured by the black. There were no windows, no corners, no obvious floor. The walls were lost in the depth. He stepped inside. The floor was solid beneath his feet, but unnaturally cold. The temperature dropped with startling speed, sinking through his shoes and into his bones. His breath fogged faintly in front of him. The smell, stronger now, was something like wet bark mixed with the coppery tang of rusted iron. He moved forward slowly, keeping the beam of the flashlight pointed straight ahead. Behind him, the door closed without sound. Kevin didn't turn around. He kept walking. Though the room was not large, certainly no more than 12 feet wide when measured from the outside, it seemed to stretch endlessly inward. His footsteps made no echo. The light illuminated only what stood directly in front of him, which remained uniform and unchanging. Blank walls, smooth floor, ceiling just out of reach. No furniture, no fixtures. Then, somewhere deep within the structure, behind the walls or beneath them, came the first scrape. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp, like a wire drawn slowly across wood. It lasted no more than a few seconds, followed by silence. Then another scrape. Then another. The rhythm didn't repeat itself. It lacked pattern and direction. It suggested movement, but not origin. Kevin slowed his steps. He felt as though he had been walking for much longer than the room should have allowed. When he finally stopped, he turned in a slow circle and raised the flashlight toward the back wall, if it could be called that. The beam landed on something that looked painted, but with a material too thick and textured to be pigment. The mural stretched from floor to ceiling, covering the entirety of the surface. At first, he thought it depicted a tree, its roots twisting down, its branches coiling upward. But upon closer inspection, the shapes resolved into something far less natural. Bodies, hundreds of them. Not drawn in full detail, but implied through lines, curves, and segments. Some were featureless, others wore faces half-formed, their mouths stretched open in what might have been song or scream. Arms stretched upward like vines, legs spiraled into each other until they were indistinguishable from roots. Toward the center of the mural, the figures dissolved entirely into a mass of filaments, veins, nerves, worms, drawn together in a massive circular knot. Kevin stepped closer. The surface was uneven. The paint, or whatever had been used, shone faintly under the light, giving the impression of something still alive. Then, without so much as a flicker or warning, the flashlight died. Kevin stood in the dark, the void closing in around him like water flooding a room. The cold deepened, wrapping around his chest, pushing at his shoulders. He felt the air grow taut, as though something massive had stirred just out of reach. And then, from behind him, or perhaps from within him, came the voices. They whispered, layered and low, and Kevin could not distinguish whether they were speaking to him or through him. He heard his name once, then his father's, then something else entirely, a language composed of vowel sounds and wet syllables that crawled across his skin. He staggered backward and pressed his hand to the mural behind him. It pulsed. There was no longer any sense of direction. He turned once, twice, unsure which way he had come. The room offered no guidance. And then the dream began. He was in the kitchen again, but not as he remembered it. Everything was covered in a yellowing haze, as though left too long in the sun. The cabinets were warped, the windows dripped with condensation. His father sat at the table, hunched and still, staring into the middle distance. Kevin tried to speak, but no sound came out. Peter turned slowly. "It was in her first," he said. "Then me." His eyes were empty, not blind, empty, as though scooped out. "It has your eyes now." Kevin woke with a start. He was lying on the floor of the hallway, the door to the dead room shut tight behind him. The boards still lay in a heap to the side. His hands ached. His breath came slow and shallow. He looked down and saw black streaks on his palms, the same oily residue that had coated the mural. Somewhere, deep within the house, the scraping sound resumed. Part 6. No one saw Kevin Cranston leave the house. The truck remained parked in the same spot, half obscured by tall grass and flaking birch saplings. The mailbox remained empty for weeks. No lights were seen inside the home after the evening of the storm, when several neighbors claimed the lightning had struck somewhere close, perhaps the old well, or the iron weather vane that had long since rusted itself to stillness. There had been no sound of an engine, no trail of footprints along the muddy drive, and no sign of struggle. The front door was locked when the sheriff arrived, and the windows remained unbroken. Only the faint odor of something off lingered around the frame of the structure. Deputies who entered the home found it undisturbed. The furniture stood exactly as it had been for decades. The air was stale. A blanket lay across the back of the couch, slightly rumpled as if someone had slept there. A cup, half filled with water, sat on the edge of the kitchen counter. Upstairs, the bedrooms were empty and undisturbed, save for a single cassette tape left unspooled on the carpet, the magnetic strip tangled in the carpet fibers. In the hallway, they found the door. It had been resealed. Not hastily, and not with the tools that Kevin had last used. The planks across the dead room door were darker now, as though aged overnight. The nails that held them in place were long and oxidized, their heads blackened and irregular, buried deep into the wood as though driven by something stronger than hand or hammer. The boards themselves were warped and splintered at the edges, and the door frame bore faint impressions where the wall appeared to have bowed inward, drawn toward the doorway as if by gravity or thirst. The deputies logged it all in the report. Subject missing, residence abandoned, no signs of forced entry or departure, door sealed from unknown source. Investigation closed pending further developments. Edna Thorne passed the house 3 days later. She didn't slow her steps as she neared the edge of the Cranston property, but she glanced toward the upper window, the one with the cracked pane and the warped frame, and saw a figure watching her from behind the glass. It did not move or draw the curtain aside or make any gesture or greeting or warning, but it stood there, unmistakably still, with its shoulders slightly slouched and its head cocked just enough to suggest it had only recently remembered how to mimic the way a person stands. She did not look again. Instead, she kept walking, her feet unsteady on the gravel path as she passed the tree line and continued down the road toward her home. She said nothing of it to the neighbors, not even to her niece, who came to stay with her on weekends and who, one morning, found Edna sitting silently on the porch with her tea gone cold, her eyes fixed on something far away that only she could see. 6 months later, the house sold to a man named Robert Flanagan, who had recently retired from a logistics firm in Columbus and dreamed of restoring an old home in the country. He arrived in early April with a moving truck and a blue tarp covering mismatched antique furniture strapped down with nylon cords. He brought a toolbox, a camping cot, a battery-powered radio, and an eagerness sharpened by ignorance. He unlocked the front door, stepped inside, and was immediately struck by the way the house seemed to lean. Not physically, but perceptually, an almost imperceptible dip in perspective, as if the walls were listening. He paused briefly in the threshold, uncertain, then shook it off and began unloading. By the second day, he had decided the upstairs would require more work than he'd anticipated. The wallpaper peeled in great curling sheets. The carpet felt damp, despite the absence of water damage, and the ceiling in the west bedroom gave off a soft creak when walked beneath. The downstairs, however, remained solid. He told himself the house had good bones. On the third morning, while retrieving his gloves from the mailbox, he found a single envelope resting inside. It had no stamp, no return address, just a folded piece of paper within, written in a sharp, shaking hand. "Don't open the dead room." He read it 3 times. Then, uncertain whether the note was a prank or an old joke passed between locals, he crumpled the page and tossed it into the trash bin beside the kitchen sink. That night, after dinner, he noticed the hallway felt colder than the rest of the house. He attributed it to the structure's age and went to bed early, determined to begin stripping the cabinets the following morning. The house stood still beneath the rising moon, quiet and compliant, its windows dark, its eaves whispering faintly with the shifting breeze. And in the hallway, beneath the boards and behind the sealed door, something moved. The planks bowed inward ever so slightly, creaking, not from pressure, but from breath. The door pulsed against its frame with slow, rhythmic motion, an inhalation, a hesitation, and then a soft exhale into the space between walls, as if it dreamed of something new. That was My Father Kept a Dead Room by Sebastian Ormond, performed by yours truly, Malcolm Blackwood.
If the floor plan says the room doesn't exist, believe it. And if your father nailed it shut with 8 iron boards, maybe don't pry it open like it's a time capsule.
Whew, that's sage advice, Otis. Advice our protagonist would have been wise to follow. After all, that house didn't just trap memories, it digested them.
Next up, we step into America's oldest city, where ghost tours walk the line between folklore and fact. But some guides don't lead you home again. In tonight's third story, Camille comes to St. Augustine chasing forgotten history and finds a flyer for a midnight walking tour led by a man named Jeremiah. The tour takes her deeper into alleys that time forgot and into the story beneath the city. This is Shadows of St. Augustine by Everett Margrave, performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry. Part 1. The iron gate at the edge of Charlotte Street let out a brittle screech as Camille Wren pressed it inward with her forearm, careful not to let her suitcase topple sideways against the uneven brick. The fence, once black, now bore the fading bronze hue of salt-weathered paint, and the wrought iron pattern above the entrance curved like thorn vines curling in on themselves. The gate led to a narrow, shaded walkway of coquina and moss, flanked on either side by camphor and wild oleander. Though it was just past noon, the path held on to the shadows as if reluctant to let the daylight pass. She paused at the first worn step of the porch, adjusting the strap of her shoulder bag and glancing up at the house that would be hers for the week. It was 2 stories tall and painted a soft seafoam green that had since faded to something closer to parchment. The lattice beneath the porch was crooked in places, and the railings had begun to peel, exposing the graying wood underneath like bones breaching the skin. A blue and white placard hung beside the door. Reading House Inn, established 1890, though Camille, having done her research, suspected the building was far older than that. She knocked twice, and the door opened with such immediacy that she flinched slightly. Mrs. Redding stood in the doorway without expression. Her white hair was twisted in a tight bun, and her clothing, though plain, appeared freshly pressed. Her eyes, pale and watchful, flicked from Camille to her bag and back again. "Miss Wren," she said, voice dry and formal. "You're earlier than most." Camille smiled politely and stepped inside when offered. The interior smelled of lavender polish and time-worn paper. She was led through a narrow hall where paintings of Spanish forts and galleons hung beneath aging crown molding. The floor creaked with each step, but the house had none of the artificial charm of modern B&Bs. It was authentic in the way that mattered. The way that left no doubt it had once stood alone in a different city, one built atop hard-packed sand and broken treaties. Mrs. Redding stopped at the foot of the stairs and gestured upward with 2 fingers. "Room 5, it's at the end, toward the back. Cooler there, usually." Her voice dropped half an octave, and quieter. Camille nodded, murmured her thanks, and began to ascend, only to stop as the woman spoke again. "If you're here for the beaches, they're best before noon. The wind picks up after that." A pause. "And if you're here for the ghost stories, I recommend you stay where the maps can still find you. The city forgets people sometimes." The remark might have been flippant, but the delivery was too exacting, the tone too measured. Camille offered a nervous smile and continued up the stairs without pressing the point. She unpacked slowly in her room, placing her books on the old dresser beneath the window and folding her shirts into the drawers one by one. Outside, the garden was overgrown and rustling in a way that didn't quite match the movement of the breeze. Spanish moss hung low from a leaning oak near the property wall. Every so often, she thought she saw something shift just beyond the boundary, though when she leaned closer, there was only wind. Camille had chosen St. Augustine, not for sand or sun, but for its layers. The city was built in strata, Spanish, British, Confederate, and modern, all stacked atop the bones of something far older. It had never quite shaken its sense of intrusion, of having been placed where something else once ruled. By late afternoon, she wandered the old quarter, scribbling notes into her leather-bound journal and browsing the outdoor racks of a used bookstore. She admired the massed coquina walls of the Castillo de San Marcos and walked the perimeter of the old cemetery just off Cordova, where wrought iron crosses jutted like broken teeth from the sunken grass. It was in a narrow alley between a print shop and a wine bar that she saw it. A flyer, aged to a tobacco hue and affixed to a bulletin board with a rusted tack. The paper looked older than it had any right to be, curling at the edges and stained with old watermarks. Jeremiah's Midnight Walk. Follow the flame through the city's forgotten skin. Lanterns provided, departing nightly at 11:30. Meet at the Stone Arch near Avels. There was no website listed, no contact number, just a hand-drawn compass rose and an intricate border of ivy and thorns. Camille tore off one of the pull tabs along the bottom and slipped it into her pocket. That night, after returning briefly to change into something warmer, she made her way to the rendezvous point. The archway at the mouth of Avale Street stood silent beneath the orange glow of gaslights, and Camille wasn't the only one waiting. A small group had gathered, 5 or 6 in total, each standing apart from the others, as if aware on some level that intimacy might be discouraged. Then he arrived. Jeremiah moved with a grace that felt out of place in the modern world. His lantern swaying gently in his grip. His coat was long and black, flaring slightly at the knees, and his boots clicked in perfect rhythm against the pavers. His features were striking in a way that avoided beauty. His face was pale and elongated, his eyes too light to guess the color. When he spoke, his voice fell smooth and quiet, but reached the ears of all present. "Thank you for joining me tonight," he said. "The city you see by day is a painting. What we see by flame is what remains beneath." No one responded. No one needed to. He turned and the group followed. As they walked, Camille began to notice subtle inconsistencies in their surroundings. The air thickened in the alleys they passed through, scented faintly with burnt sugar and something acrid she couldn't quite place. All the while, Jeremiah never stumbled or hesitated. They passed a bakery with its shutters drawn, and a brindled dog laying nearby lifted its head. As Jeremiah drew near, the animal's ears folded back. It stood abruptly and barked, once, then twice, low and furious. Its hackles bristled, and it lunged forward, only to be jerked back by its leash. The sound it made was more growl than voice, the kind of warning animals give when something wrong is near. Jeremiah did not look at it. Camille looked up. As he moved past the next archway, the flame in his lantern flickered sharply. Overhead, the gaslights dimmed, then flared again once he had gone. By the time they reached the first landmark, a weather-worn wall etched with 17th century graffiti, Camille was no longer certain what day it was or whether the others walking beside her had ever introduced themselves at all. Part 2. The group followed Jeremiah in uneasy silence, each drawn forward more by instinct than intention. He did not ask for names, nor did he offer his own again, as though he assumed anyone standing before him already knew who he was, or had at the very least been told. Their path wove tightly between weather-smoothed buildings and shuttered galleries. Old iron gates stood half open in arched entryways, where candle-lit patios once held music and murmured seductions. Jeremiah raised his lantern as he walked, letting its flickering light dance across flaking plaster and chipped stone. He stopped in front of a wooden sign whose lettering had long since faded beneath layers of mildew and sea air, though faint traces of red still clung to the edges. Without needing to be prompted, he began his tale. In 1740, he said, this quarter was burned by the Oglethorpe's cannons. But what was left standing, what remained intact, became the foundation for something older. You see, when you build over fire, things that burn down are never entirely gone. They linger beneath the surface, sometimes in the mortar, sometimes in the mind. He stepped forward again, and the group followed. At the corner where the Coquina wall curved in on itself, a narrow corridor revealed itself, too narrow for vehicles, and almost too narrow for the group to pass without brushing the sides. The alley was paved with irregular stones, some of them wet as if from rain that hadn't fallen. Moss clung to the walls like frost in a dream. And Camille heard Jeremiah's voice again, this time quieter, almost reverent. Every city has a story it refuses to tell. In St. Augustine's case, that story begins with a woman named Annabel Coit. He turned and faced the group, letting the lantern hang low by his thigh. She was born in 1819, married in 1841, and disappeared in the spring of 1843. Her husband said she went walking in the early morning, hoping to watch the herons along the marsh wall, and she never returned. They found her bonnet at the edge of the tidal basin, pressed flat into the silt as though placed there deliberately. No other trace remained, no drag marks, no footprints, only that small blue velvet hat, still damp with dew. Camille, arms folded now against the light chill in the air, felt herself draw forward unconsciously. Jeremiah tilted his head and smiled. Some said she had drowned. Others whispered she had taken up with a soldier and fled north under darkness. But those who truly knew her, the maids, the tradesmen, the children she taught on Sundays, spoke of a different fear. They remembered Annabel's stories. She used to tell them of a man in mourning black who walked the streets when the city slept. Not a ghost, she said, and not a man either. Just a thing in human shape. She'd seen him once, staring from behind the cemetery gate, unmoving. In her final weeks, she swore to those who'd listened that she could hear him walking behind her, pacing the distance between them. Jeremiah stepped backward then, placing himself beside a wrought iron gate that led into a small, overgrown plot of land. The space was enclosed by broken fencing and scattered with marble fragments, what may once have been tombstones, but were now reduced to illegible shapes, eroded by centuries of wind and salt. Camille thought she saw something scratched into one of the stones, but the angle was wrong and the lantern light too erratic. She was last seen, he continued, wandering toward the marshes. Her face was pale, her hands were bare, even in the cold. A woman who had prepared to leave, but had not brought anything with her to stay away. He let the silence breathe before continuing. The man in black, it said, still walks the alleys. He's not always seen or felt, but those who vanish in this city tend to vanish in his direction. Camille looked around, expecting to see curious, uneasy faces beside her. But the man who had been standing to her right, the one in the red windbreaker who had earlier joked about bringing sage, was no longer there. She scanned the group quickly, counting only 4 beside herself. Hadn't there been 6 when they began? Before she could speak, the woman to her left muttered under her breath, "Not again." Camille turned, but the woman had already turned away, stepping to the rear of the group with her arms crossed and her face half hidden beneath her hood. Jeremiah said nothing. He resumed walking. They passed beneath an archway where the walls narrowed again, and the group's footsteps felt quieter, muffled by moss and moisture. Overhead, the branches of a sprawling tree leaned into the space, casting shadows across the stone. Camille stepped lightly, eyes scanning the shapes and patterns etched along the alleyway's base. Most were initials, dates, hearts, and crosses, but some markings were stranger. Circles with flared ends, tiny handprints, spirals broken in 2. They were too low to have been graffiti, too old to be recent. Jeremiah paused and turned to a metal grate in the ground, round and blackened with age. "Here," he said, "is the true threshold." He knelt, setting the lantern beside the grate. The flame shuddered and lowered, though no wind moved through the corridor. "This marks the entry to the original cistern system," he said. "Built by the early Spanish settlers, it served not only to catch rain, but to channel runoff from the higher streets. In time, the tunnels beneath began to erode, and a decision was made to seal them." He looked up, meeting Camille's eyes for the briefest moment. But not all tunnels were sealed. He rose and walked again, leading them toward the southeastern edge of the old district. The buildings grew older here, less touched by renovation. Windows bore slatted wood, some nailed shut. Shutters hung at crooked angles. Doorways sloped to one side as if tired from holding their shape for too long. The alleyways bent at irregular angles, forcing the group to pivot every few steps. By now, Camille had begun to feel a dull pressure in her ears, like the sensation that follows sudden altitude. The sound of the others' footsteps seemed to lag behind them by a half-second. The night had cooled significantly, but the air had taken on a dampness that clung to the skin. It smelled like wet rope left too long in a basement. Beneath that, something sweeter lingered, cloying and sharp, like dried herbs left to rot in their bundle. The group passed beneath a carved stone lintel that bore no writing. The arch it supported narrowed into a tunnel framed by coral-studded walls and low wooden beams. It was here that the path changed. Camille saw it first in the light, how the glow from Jeremiah's lantern no longer fell evenly. The darkness ahead did not recede from the flame, but rather seemed to absorb it, swallowing its edges and softening its reach. The tunnel smelled of incense gone stale, of oil and mildew, and something beneath that, metallic, old, and sour. She hesitated. Jeremiah, noticing, turned and extended a reassuring hand. "There's nothing here you haven't seen before," he said. "Only what you've forgotten." Camille stepped forward. The flame quivered again, and for a moment, just before she passed beneath the lintel, she thought she heard whispering from somewhere below. Part 3. Camille awoke later than she had intended, the light already cresting high through the lace-curtained window at the rear of room 5. She had dreamed, though the fragments slipped too easily from her grasp, dissolving into the fabric of morning like vapor trailing off a pane. What lingered was the sense of having wandered too far from safety, of voices spoken from mouths that were never seen, and footsteps that did not echo her own. The sheets were cold beside her shoes damp from the night before, and sat where she had left them beneath the sill, though there was now a smear of dark residue near the heel that hadn't been there before. She dressed with care, her fingers lingering at each button, and then made her way down to the first floor, hoping to find tea and perhaps something to settle the unsettled feeling in her chest. Mrs. Redding was already in the parlor, polishing the silver teapot with a cloth worn thin from use. The air smelled of beeswax and orange peel, though the windows remained closed and the sky outside showed no intention of letting the wind move freely. When Camille entered, the woman looked up with that same assessing glance she'd worn on their first meeting, sharp, searching, and quiet. "You stayed out late," Mrs. Redding said. Camille offered a half smile and folded herself into the corner chair beside the bookshelf. "I took the ghost tour," she replied. The older woman's hand slowed. "The one with the man in black?" she asked, too casually. Camille hesitated, then nodded. "Jeremiah, he's different." The cloth in Miss Redding's hand stopped moving entirely. She set the teapot down with an audible clink and turned toward Camille with an expression that did not mask its concern. "You should leave that one alone," she said. "You should have left the moment he spoke to you." Camille leaned forward, frowning. "Why? You said there were stories in this city, and that's all he's telling. Stories." "Is that what you think he's doing?" Mrs. Redding asked. "My cousin June took a tour in 1956. Summer, hot as hell. She was 16, foolish, and convinced the world could be sorted out if you only walked far enough into it." Camille sat back slightly, listening. "She told me the man she met was charming, educated, and kind, that he took her down roads that weren't in any book she'd read. He spoke of things no one should know, dates, names, and smells, how the execution square used to run thick in the rain, how the gallows rotted from the inside, how a man's heart sounds different once it realizes the noose is caught." Mrs. Redding lowered herself into the chair opposite Camille and folded her hands. She said his eyes looked like a priest's, steady and solemn, but his hands, she said, they were wrong. Wrong in the way a crow's wings are wrong when you see them up close, too careful, always hiding what they meant to do. Camille said nothing, her fingers now resting on the edge of her knee. "June was never seen again," Mrs. Redding said. "We found her locket buried in the courtyard by the mission ruins 2 weeks later. No other trace, not a thread, and no record of the man she'd met. Only her letters. One mentioned a name she couldn't spell properly. Started with an A, ended in something like Leth." Camille felt the room tilt slightly around her. "Aquin Saleth?" she said. The older woman's face turned pale in stages, as if the color were draining not just from her skin, but from the memory behind it. "I'd forgotten that part," she admitted, "until now." Later that day, Camille made her way to the city archives. The building, constructed with heavy brick and lined with tall, narrow windows, stood just outside the historical district and bore the kind of silence that invited reverence. She passed through the metal detectors, signed the visitor's log, and was led by a volunteer to the back rooms where old city records, property surveys, and photographic collections were maintained on microfilm and sealed in temperature-controlled cabinets. She asked to see anything related to public executions held between 1850 and 1870, claiming it was part of a university thesis. The volunteer nodded, indifferent, and returned 10 minutes later with a thin folder and a magnifying plate. Most of the photographs were indistinct, blurry captures of haphazardly assembled crowds, soldiers in loose formation, and wooden platforms erected in front of shuttered chapels. Many of the images were too degraded to be useful, but one was not. In the center of the photograph, a man hung limp from the gallows beam, face turned away from the lens. Standing at the base of the platform were 3 clergymen and a woman in mourning attire. To the right, separated slightly from the others, and caught half in shadow, was a tall figure in a long black coat. His face was not entirely visible, but Camille recognized the posture, the lean of the shoulders, the angle of the jaw. The fingers, long and gloved, rested lightly atop the brim of a wide hat. He was watching the proceedings with no apparent emotion. She stared at the image for a long time, then took a quick photograph of it with her phone before returning the file and stepping out into the afternoon light. The streets were louder now, filled with foot traffic and music spilling from corner bars, yet Camille felt none of it touched her. The city moved around her like a current passing someone already underwater. She returned to the Redding house shortly before sunset, intending to rest and perhaps reorganize her notes, but Jeremiah was waiting on the porch. He stood just beyond the reach of the overhang, his silhouette framed by the amber glow of the gas lamp across the street. His lantern was not lit, but he held it nonetheless, as if it were an extension of his arm rather than a tool he carried. "Miss Wren," he said, his voice soft, "you left before the tour concluded." She stepped back instinctively, her hand brushing against the edge of the railing. "I thought it was over." "It really is," he replied. "There's still one last stop, the most important one." His gaze was steady, but not without warmth. If he was disappointed, it did not show. There was no anger, only a quiet sense of anticipation, as if the moment had been rehearsed and now waited for her to play her part. Camille hesitated. The warning still echoed in her mind, and the image of the photograph had not left her thoughts. But beneath the anxiety was another feeling, one she could not entirely name. It was not trust or hope, but curiosity. "Where is it?" she asked. Jeremiah's smile was small, almost imperceptible. "Close," he said. "Closer than you think." She nodded once, more to herself than him. "I'll go." Part 4. Jeremiah led her without a word through the streets that seemed to stretch longer than they had the night before. The city was different in half-light, less a place and more a suggestion of one, its edges softening as though slowly being forgotten. The gas lamps, though lit, shed only the most reluctant light, and Camille found herself walking not by visibility but by memory, recalling the turns they'd taken previously, and the angles at which buildings leaned, as if all St. Augustine structures had been crafted by hands trembling with age. They passed beneath a cloistered corridor between 2 shuttered inns, then down a tight passage of broken stone steps, where vines curled in from between the walls. Jeremiah said nothing, nor did he check to see if she followed, but she did, because the alternative was to remain alone in a city that left her with the feeling that she was being watched from below. As they descended, the architectural details began to change. The coquina blocks that had defined the Spanish era gave way first to smooth sandstone, then to a material Camille could not identify. Dark, glossy, and veined with milky quartz, like obsidian warped by heat and formed into unnatural angles. The walls narrowed, but the ceiling rose, forming an arched passage lined with shallow alcoves. Inside each recess stood a figure, not fully human, but sculpted in the semblance of one. Tall, thin, and eyeless, their hands pressed together as if in mourning. Jeremiah walked between them without hesitation. Camille, though slower, followed with a mixture of awe and apprehension. The air in this corridor was colder, the scent more ancient than anything she had known. Damp earth, faded incense, and the coppery trace of something left too long buried. When her hand brushed the wall beside her for balance, it came away faintly blackened, the residue clinging to her fingertips, like ash. At a certain point, she realized that the light had changed. It no longer came from his lantern, though he still carried it. The flame remained lit, but it flickered without projection, its glow failing to reach the stone just inches beyond its curve. Instead, a faint luminescence issued from the very walls themselves, soft and gray, like bioluminescence glimpsed beneath deep water. The stone, now fully black and laced with thin veins of gold and bone white, gave the impression of being alive. Its carvings, etched in looping vertical lines and interspersed with jagged indentations, formed no language she recognized. Yet they seemed to shift subtly when she looked too long, realigning their patterns like something reconfiguring itself in response to being observed. She tried to speak, to ask where they were or how far they'd gone, but couldn't find the words. Jeremiah finally stopped before a wide threshold framed by cracked pillars. Beyond it, the tunnel opened into a chamber far larger than the path that had led to it. The ceiling soared high above them in a vaulted dome, its surface patterned with inlaid discs of polished stone that caught no light but gleamed nonetheless. At the chamber's center stood a raised altar, not of wood or marble, but of black coral, glossy, uneven, and speckled with flecks of silver. It was the kind of material one did not shape so much as reveal, as it had been always existed beneath the ground and merely waited for the correct rites to bring it forth. The chapel that housed it was a ruin, but its bones remained intact. Columns wrapped in moss and carved with weather-worn figures lined its perimeter. At the far end of the chamber stood what must have been once a pulpit, though it bore no cross, no iconography familiar to any Western tradition. Instead, the shape etched into the back wall was a series of concentric rings broken by a single vertical line, unmistakably intentional, though its meaning was as opaque as the rest of this place. Jeremiah gestured toward the altar with a faint inclination of his chin, and Camille approached. She could hear her own footsteps echoing off the walls now, but not in the way sound normally bounces through space. The echoes were staggered, delayed by fractions of a section too long, and they returned with a faint distortion, as if the walls themselves were answering back in some lost dialect. And then she heard it. It was not spoken aloud, not by him, but filled the chamber regardless, low and rhythmic, the sound of a name carried by the stone itself. Akenseleth. 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 Did not rise in pitch or tempo, but instead built itself into the texture of the room. The name became a vibration felt behind her teeth and inside her skull, growing stronger not with volume but with presence, as though the chamber itself had begun to remember what it once was. Camille turned to Jeremiah, her throat dry and her heart clenching with the slow panic of realization. But he was already walking the outer edge of the room, his lantern held low, swinging in an arc with each step, as though measuring something older than time. She stepped closer to the altar. On its surface lay a single object, a small pendant made of yellow bone, smooth at the edges but carved at its center with two initials, C.W. She recoiled slightly at first, then extended her hand. The pendant was warm to the touch, not like something freshly carved, but like a thing held in a closed fist for a long time. The letters were exact, her initials. There could be no mistake. She looked back toward Jeremiah, but he did not acknowledge her. His face was turned toward one of the moss-covered walls, where he stood completely still, save for the slow rise and fall of his shoulders. The walls behind him had begun to change. It was subtle at first, the faint shift of surface texture, the glistening sheen growing stronger as if drawn upward from beneath the stone. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, the carvings began to stretch as though something beneath the surface was pressing outward. Dust trickled from the carvings and drifted along the curve of the wall, hovering in place for a moment before being pulled back toward the ceiling. Camille took a step backward. The altar beneath her hand grew colder. The pendant, still clutched in her palm, began to vibrate. Jeremiah turned then, his eyes not meeting hers, but fixed somewhere behind her, toward the entrance from which they had come. "It's listening now," he said. Camille did not ask what it was. She already knew. Part 5. The air in the chapel grew heavier, in a way that strained the senses. The light had no origin now, the glow coming from nowhere and everywhere, casting faint shadows that crossed in directions the architecture did not allow. The walls no longer stood still, they moved in increments that defied motion. Edges flexing, corners warping, angles bending inward without folding, as though some greater geometry had begun to press through the mortar and stone. Jeremiah stopped beside the altar, his face lifted toward the ceiling, eyes closed, arms at his sides as if in the presence of something divine. The wall behind him began to open, with the slow parting of material that had once masqueraded as stone. The shape that emerged took on the suggestion of form, rising without lifting, advancing without moving. It was not made of flesh or bone or smoke or any material Camille could name, but it folded in upon itself in layers of black and gray, angles that bent toward her without traveling any visible distance. Augustine had arrived. She did not scream, though she felt her body preparing to do so. Her throat tightened and her legs shifted, but her breath caught in awe, not in the awe of witnessing something beautiful, but the awe one feels at a void so deep it cannot be filled, a hunger older than language or thought, unrepentant in its existence. Jeremiah's voice, when it returned, was resigned. "They asked for protection," he said. "The ones who first built here. They wanted permanence, legacy. They made a promise in a tongue not theirs, to a thing they did not understand, and it heard them." He looked at Camille, his expression absence of warmth now, filled instead with the blankness of ritual. "It still hears," he said, "and it remembers." The shape behind him had grown in volume, though not in clarity. Camille could not tell how far it extended or where it began. It was not bound by the room. It reached into her thoughts and curled around them like vines around stone. "It's not the body it takes," Jeremiah continued. "It's the name, the memory, the echo that lives in the minds of those who survive. Every generation must carry it forward, a remembrance offering, not to die, but to know, and to never be allowed to forget." She wanted to move, to speak, to object. Instead, the altar pulsed once, then again, and something brushed against her temples. Camille stumbled backward as her vision was seized by something vast and ancient. She saw a clearing deep in the swamplands, lit by torchlight, where masked figures in bone and ash danced around a pit dug deep in the earth. She saw their faces painted in blood, heard a chant in a language unspoken by any living throat. And its scene changed. Spanish missionaries, gaunt and sunstruck, stood in circles around the same pit, holding crucifixes with white knuckles, whispering prayers while throwing oil into the earth. The centuries passed before her like smoke rising through broken glass. British settlers followed, then Confederate deserters, Then men in dark coats bearing surveying tools, each fitting the ground not with sacrifice, but with attention, with remembrance, and the thing beneath the earth drank of it all. Camille staggered, her knees hit the floor. The pendant, clutched in her hand, burned hot now, searing her palm. She opened her mouth to scream, but only managed a dry croak. The entity pressed closer, its limbs, or what passed for limbs, coiling around the altar. Jeremiah stepped forward. He stood above her now, his eyes fixed on nothing. "The city endures," he said, "and so does the pact." The name rose again. Akinsalith. 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 The stones beneath her vibrated with it. Her memories began to slip, not all at once, but in threads, names, dates, faces, dissolving from their edges inward. She tried to hold on to the sound of her mother's voice and could not remember its pitch. She tried to recall her own age, her own phone number, her own middle name, and found them receding, replaced by circular glyphs in dark water. Then a command cut through the vibration. "Down!" A pouch struck the floor inches from her face, exploding in a puff of bitter red smoke and dust. Camille coughed, recoiling as the air thickened again, carrying with it the scent of salt, iron, and resin. Disrupted, the shape twisted in on itself. It receded partially, as though interrupted mid-thought. Jeremiah turned, startled, for the first time since the ritual had begun. Mrs. Redding stood at the edge of the chamber. Her coat was torn, her hair wild in the flickering gloom, and her left hand clutched a bundle of herbs and crushed minerals wrapped in cloth. Her right hand filled another pouch, this one still sealed. "You don't get this one," she said, her voice hard and unfamiliar. Jeremiah didn't move, but the entity behind him reacted. One of its tendrils, or projections, reached toward the woman. She flung the second pouch, striking the air just above its outstretched curve. The smoke surged again, darker this time, and Camille heard something that resembled surprise. The stone ceiling shifted, sagging, as though gravity had reasserted itself. The glyphs faded. The glow receded. Jeremy stepped backward, blinking as if only now realizing where he stood. Then the voice returned, this time from Jeremiah himself. "Take me then," he whispered, his gaze fixed on the altar. "I was the first. Let me be the last." He stepped onto the raised platform. The room pulled inward. The walls met, and the space collapsed in on itself. The entity folded over Jeremiah's shape like a cloak swallowing its owner. For a moment, Camille thought she saw his face, serene, almost relieved, before it was consumed by the weight of all that ancient darkness. Then all at once, the pressure broke. The stone cracked underfoot, and the light vanished. Camille felt Mrs. Redding's hand on her shoulder. "We need to go," the woman said, and she did not wait for agreement. They ran through the corridor, the chants fading behind them, the name no longer spoken, though it still echoed in the walls of Camille's thoughts. When they reached the entrance, the cracked arch that had first admitted her into the chapel, it was sealed behind them. There was no path back, only root-choked stone and dripping moss. Mrs. Redding did not speak again until they reached the surface. By then, Camille's thoughts were unspooling in ways she couldn't organize. In the quiet that followed, with only moonlight on their backs and the surf crashing somewhere unseen, she realized she had brought something with her. The chant had not stopped. It simply lived in her now. Akinsalith, Akinsalith, Akinsalith. Part 6. When Camille emerged from the narrow corridor that had once been a stairwell and now resembled only a rent in the foundation of some abandoned warehouse, the city appeared foreign. The familiar buildings along the outer edge of St. Augustine's historic quarter stood in place. Her map had not betrayed her. but their facades appeared somehow duller, dulled by a film that seemed to hang across the surface, like dust suspended on glass. The colors were wrong in subtle ways, bricks redder than they should have been, shutters faded beyond their years. The foot traffic moved as it always had, yet the echoes of footsteps returned just a beat too late, as if the stone beneath them were remembering how to mimic sound. Even the air carried something new, or perhaps something old, newly returned. It smelled not only of the sea and stone and citrus from the nearby cafe, but also of incense and salt and a strange dry sharpness she couldn't quite name, like wood that had burned too long in a sacred fire. She followed Mrs. Redding in silence back to the Redding House Inn, neither of them speaking until the iron gate clicked closed behind them. The sound echoed louder than it should have, reverberating against the siding of the house before dying in the overgrown shrubs. Inside, the light was warmer and the scents more human. Lavender, polish, beeswax, and aging paper. But Camille remained unable to let go of the sense that something had come with her. Mrs. Raylan sat across from her in the parlor. Her left sleeve had been torn, and a streak of soot or ash still traced the side of her cheek, though she did not seem to notice. Her hands, however, moved with steadiness, wrapping the pouch she had used in the ritual inside a strip of linen before placing it into a cedar box lined with folded cloth and paled stones. "You should leave in the morning," she said, not unkindly. "The longer you stay, the deeper it settles." Camille nodded, her fingers curled around the bone pendant, which no longer felt hot. She spoke softly. "Is it gone?" Mrs. Redding didn't look at her when she answered. "No, it's never gone. Only sleeping, and sleeping things always wake." The rest of the night passed in sleepless silence. She closed her eyes, but they opened again at intervals, always uncertain whether she'd been dreaming or simply blinking for too long. When morning arrived, it did so without ceremony. No bird song, no golden rays cast across the bedspread, just a slow brightening of the sky beyond the window pane, diffused through fog that had rolled in from the east and blanketed the rooftops in a pall of quiet. She packed her things and left without ceremony, pausing only once at the front door, where Mrs. Redding handed her a slip of paper. Written in pencil were 3 names, each one crossed out, and beneath them a 4th name she did not recognize, left untouched. "If you ever feel it rising," the woman said, "go here. They'll know what to do." Camille took the note without speaking and stepped out into the fog. She left St. Augustine that day, her car taking her across the narrow bridge and out past the salt marshes, where the sun began to burn through the mist. The sky above the mainland was clearer, the trees more distinct, but she found herself checking the rearview mirror often for signs of movement where there should have been none. In the weeks that followed, she returned to school and resumed her studies. The term paper she had once planned to write on colonial architecture remained unwritten, and her professors, noting her distraction, offered her extensions she did not request. She no longer walked alone at night. She no longer listened to music without headphones. She no longer dreamed of anything that did not involve stone walls and breathless silence. And always, just before waking, she heard the name, Saleth. Not spoken aloud, but there, nonetheless. The dreams grew less frequent, but they never left. Then one evening, weeks later, beneath the lengthening shadows of an early spring sunset, another young woman arrived at the Redding House Inn. She looked to be a student, not much older than Camille had been, with a soft blue backpack and a half-finished iced coffee in one hand. She knocked twice, waited, and then knocked again. Mrs. Redding opened the door, and for a moment her eyes lingered on the girl's face. The student smiled. "I called last week. I'm here for the weekend." Mrs. Redding nodded, stepping aside to let her in. Across the street, just beyond the iron fence, a flyer fluttered loose from a telephone pole and drifted on the breeze. It spun, lifted once by the wind, and caught against the foot of a street lamp, half folded and stained by dew. Jeremiah's midnight walk. Lanterns provided, departing nightly. The ink shimmered faintly beneath the streetlight, its lettering unmarred by time. Somewhere, not far below, the stones beneath the city stirred in their sleep. Beneath the oldest city, the oldest thing waits, and still it remembers its name. And that was Shadows of St. Augustine by Everett Margrave, performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry.
If your ghost tour guide doesn't blink, doesn't smile, and remembers things no one told him, you're not on a tour, you're on a pilgrimage.
And the destination? Well, let's just say it's not on any travel brochure.
If you enjoyed tonight's journey through haunted rooms, forgotten cities, and swamp sermons, you're in luck. There's even more waiting for you in the patrons area. Extended ad-free episodes featuring bonus tales and exclusive horrors you won't hear anywhere else.
It's just $7.99 a month, or save big with a yearly plan. And it gives you full access to every story, every scream, without a single commercial break. You'll be supporting indie horror and keeping the doors to the dark wide open.
To join, just head to simplyscarypodcast.com and click the Patrons tab, or go straight to chillingtalesfordarknights.com to become a member. Come closer to the stories, if you dare.
From all of us here at Chilling Entertainment, thank you for your support.
If tonight's episode proved anything, it's that some places aren't just creepy, they're hungry. A whispering glyph, a sealed room, a ghost tour with no return ticket, a swamp god that drinks devotion, and a bar where your soul is the ante.
Tonight reminded us some thresholds should never be crossed, and some stories should never be heard. But horror doesn't wait for permission. It seeps in through cracks, speaks through silence, and waits patiently for your footstep in the dark.
Be sure to subscribe to our parent channel, Chilling Tales for Dark Nights on YouTube, and hit that bell icon so you never miss a new nightmare.
And if you'd like a little more fear to get you through the week, check out my other show, Otis Jiry's Tales from Duskwood. I'll be waiting for you every Wednesday with more shadows than sunshine.
We want to hear from you. Follow us on social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and let us know which tale tonight struck the deepest chord, or which one had you checking the locks.
And let's not forget to thank tonight's talented authors. Without their nightmares, we'd still be sleeping soundly.
But where's the fun in that? So next time someone hands you an old flyer, invites you into a room that's not on the plans, or asks if you're ready to play,
just remember, some places weren't forgotten. They were sealed for your protection.
Until next time, sleep well, listeners.
If you can. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to Scary Stories Told in the Dark, a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and a proud member of the Simply Scary Podcasts network. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com today to learn more about our network and our other amazing storytelling programs. Tonight's program was hosted, and its featured stories performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry. Selected stories have been adapted with the kind permission of their respective authors. Original music provided by Luke Hodgkinson and Jesse Cornett. Sound design and final mixing and mastering provided by executive producer and director Craig Groshek. Program's artwork and logo by David Romero. If you're looking for some fresh tales on a daily basis while waiting for the next podcast, check out my YouTube channel, the Otis Jiry channel, and my extensive collection of narrated tales there. Simply search on YouTube by my name, and you'll find me. And don't forget to subscribe and press the bell notification icon to get my latest releases. Got a scary tale of your own that you'd like performed? I take submissions. Email it to me today at otis@simplyscarypodcast.com to have your terrifying tome considered for production in a future episode of this show. That's OTIS@simplyscarypodcast.com. If you've enjoyed what you heard on tonight's program and are joining us on your favorite podcast app, subscribe to us to be sure you never miss an episode, and leave a 5-star review and a comment. Your feedback means a lot to me. You can also follow Chilling Tales for Dark Nights and yours truly on Facebook to connect anytime and get the latest updates on this and other programs and my channel. If you're listening on the Chilling Tales for Dark Nights YouTube channel, do us a favor and hit the subscribe button and the bell notification icon for ctfdn as well to get more spooky tales from me and the crew and another episode of this program each and every Wednesday. And don't forget to hit that thumbs up button to tell us how we're doing and leave a kind word or a request. And don't forget to visit us at chillingtalesfordarknights.com and consider supporting the team by becoming a patron. In addition to helping us out, you'll get exclusive access to our audio archive and ad-free downloads of all your favorite stories, including those you've heard on this program. As for me, I'll be back next Wednesday with more terrifying tales to keep you up all night. But that's all right. Who needs sleep anyway?
Chilling Tales for Dark Nights.